Isfahani. I'm out of the mid-realm and I live in the barony of the Cleflands, which is roughly the Cleveland area. I'm going to just share my screen and open up to the PowerPoint. Bear with me just one moment. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
I can see that you're that you started screen sharing, but it's just showing a blank screen that has what I just read in white text across it. There you go.
Okay,
Now
you can see
you've got a Henna Ancient Beauty. It
that's
kind of
it.
looks like interlocking circle patterns.
Perfect.
Good.
So I'll get that started here. On computer. The computer's been a little slow today, so.
Okay, we do this stuff in the evening, but I know like where I live, like if everybody's home from work, they're all doing stuff on the computer and bandwidth becomes an issue.
Right. Okay.
You know, because
Go ahead.
you've got everybody using the same resource.
Exactly. Okay, so let's get started. This class is called Henna Ancient Beauty. I always like to start with a little bit of information about myself so that you know who I am that you're listening to. Outside the SCA, my name is Eve Liebfried. I began practicing henna in 2007, back when I was in college. I've been a professional natural henna artist since 2009, and I've been certified through the International Certification for Natural Henna Artistry. I'm in the SCA, I'm Shahzada Isfahani, and like I said, I'm out of the Middle Kingdom, barony of the Cleflands. And I'll share my contact info later on as well in case you want to contact me outside of this class. Okay. So I always like to help you get in the feel by sharing a couple of period pieces. One is a poem and one is from the words of the Prophet Muhammad. So the poem goes, "Decorate your eyes with kohl, your fingers with henna. You will thus be more pleasing in the eyes of God, for you will be more loved by your husbands." And the Prophet Muhammad had said, "Use henna, it makes your head lustrous, cleanses your hearts, and will be witness in your graves." Which is interesting because we'll touch on that witness in your graves in another couple of slides. Henna has been continuously used for 4,000 years, and it has gone by many names depending on the region and the culture using it. So when you're researching henna, or if you're looking at henna even in modern times, you may come across henna, hina, mehendi, pana. Those are just a couple of names. And for something that's been around for so long and covering such a wide region, is going to have a variety of names. But the plant itself is Lawsonia inermis, and it contains a red-orange dye molecule called lawsone. You'll remember that word when we go forward because I'll be using that lawsone relating to the dye as we go on in our slides. The dye is released once the dried pulverized leaves are mixed with ingredients to create a paste. And this dye stains the layers of the skin and the keratin of nails and hair. Lawsone bonds well with keratin and protein. It works by staining your skin layers, and as your skin exfoliates, that's how it lightens and comes off with your skin. That's something that I get asked a lot. So you can see on this map here, the orangish area is where henna grows the best, and it's also probable areas of use from 3000 BC all the way up to the year 0. It grows very well in tropical semi-arid zones, and it survives periods of drought very well. So henna plants are very long-lived. They can reach anywhere from 50 years or longer. And what's interesting is the climate, soil, and water affect the lawsone, that dye content. So areas that are more dry, hot, and have iron-bearing soil, you have higher levels of lawsone. So you're going to have a greater depth of stain from something like that. If it's from a fertile, wet location, let's say from a river valley or from banks of a river, or cooler temperatures, you're going to have lower lost zone levels. And what I've always found really interesting is henna from different regions also has different dye levels and qualities. There are regional variants to henna dye tone, and you can even have slightly different levels of that red color that you're used to with henna. So for example, the henna that I use comes from Rajasthan in India, and I get a really great, deep reddish brown color. Where if you use henna that might be coming from Yemen, for example, it tends to be more of like a yellowish brown color instead of having that nice deep red. And while we don't know the exact date that henna began being used, we do know that it was dating back at least to 3000 BC. And it has been continuously used for at least 4,000 years. We'll start with the ancient world. There's been evidence of ancient Egyptians using henna to color their hair. So there have been multiple mummies over the years where we have found their hair that was hennaed. So we have the famous pharaoh Ramesses II. The wet nurse of Queen Hatshepsut was a female pharaoh. Her wet nurse, her mummy was found with hennaed hair as well. And not only was natural hair dyed with henna, they also created wigs made out of wool or human hair wigs that also had henna dyed. Something that I also find really interesting is it's believed that Pharaoh Ramesses II, he had red hair in his youth, and when he passed away, they actually freshly hennaed his hair, it's believed, because that way he would have had the brightest, reddest hair for when he first entered the afterworld. So that was something that I found during my research that I thought was just really interesting to make him look as full of youth and vigor as possible for his afterlife. There is physical, artistic, and sometimes written documentation of henna used on nails in various areas of the ancient world. So you can see in the image here, this is from the ancient Minoan settlement of Akrotiri in Greece. Those fingernails and the fingertips are an orangish red. That's not necessarily artistic license. That's what henna looks like on nails. So that very well could be hennaed fingernails in that painting. And they've also found mummies as well that also had hennaed fingertips and toes. So henna was not just used on hair at this time. Like I said, we have imagery of it being used on hands. And it was also used in the ancient Isle of Minos, early medieval Spain, China, Thailand, and India, to name but a few areas. And through a hadith, which are the sayings or anecdotes about the Prophet Muhammad, compiled between 800 and 900, we know that Muhammad, as well as other men at the time, dyed their hair and beards with henna as well. There is a hadith in which Prophet Muhammad instructs a woman to dye her fingernails with henna so as to identify her with a feminine practice. We'll talk more about henna in Islam in a couple of slides here. So henna wasn't just used for beauty, it was also used for health. Henna is a great antifungal and a great treatment for dandruff. So it's no wonder that they used it on their heads, their scalps, their hair to try and keep that fungus away, especially if they were wearing wigs a lot. It's not uncommon to get things like ringworm or other sort of fungus problems in your scalp. So this would have helped. Some of the earliest evidence of henna being used to treat various skin concerns comes from the Egyptian Ebers papyrus. And these ranged from possibly fungus and ringworm to itchiness and patchy skin, bacterial infections of the toes and feet, and more. What's really interesting is the ancient Egyptians took into account where the henna was cultivated to how it was going to be used pharmaceutically. So if you were going to be using henna and it was going to be used on or near an open cut, you wouldn't want to have something that has a high loss zone content, because what will happen is that dye will travel from the paste into and through the cut, get below the dead skin layer, and it would act almost like a tattoo. So they wouldn't have wanted to use a high dye content on an open wound or an abrasion, because you don't want to have an accidental tattoo, or it wouldn't have been it wouldn't have been something that they would have wanted for aesthetic reasons. So they would have used something, a henna that was grown closer to a river valley or something like that, where they could still get the benefits of the plant itself, but not necessarily have to deal with having the dye. Another early use of henna was to cool the body. It was traditionally applied to the palms, fingertips, toes, and soles of the feet in order to combat the heat. And Pliny the Elder, who was a Roman historian, wrote in his book that henna leaves were used medicinally and for dyeing. He said in his book that fresh leaves are kneaded and used as a cure for sores on the head and in the mouth, and a compress of the leaves is good for burns and sprains. The leaves mixed with struthium or soapwort will color the hair red. I would not suggest putting henna in your mouth because I have found out the hard way that it is not very pleasant. So that was in ancient times, and so we're going to move ahead to the spread of henna. So henna covered such a large region, so many cultures, and for such a long period of time, it was only natural that it would start to be used in ceremonial and ritual usages. It's been used in the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and more. For the brevity of this class, we're just going to cover the Abrahamic religions as well as Hinduism. As long as it is recognized that it was used by many others, we're just going to focus on these just for the sake of time. And through the increase of trade, conquest, and movement of peoples, the spread of henna usage and traditions proliferated. It spread from the northwestern territories of Africa and Moorish Spain, also called Al-Andalus, across the top of the African continent, southern Italy, and the Greek Isles, through the Middle East, India, parts of China, and even some of the Pacific Islands. It is believed that henna did begin growing in the Egypt region. And these are just a couple of pictures here depicting henna from a little bit later in the SCA time period. Henna in Judaism and the Abrahamic religions. Henna actually appears in the Bible in the Song of Songs and Judaic texts from antiquity. It was also used to mark certain celebrations like birth, coming out of mourning, and passage into adulthood. There are many regional variations on the Abrahamic henna rituals and traditions, but that's the common thread amongst them, that they've been used for rituals like birth, coming out of mourning, passage into adulthood. It's also been used for marriage and also for when they would have circumcision as well. The mother would have henna done. The earliest explicit records of henna being used in Judaism can be seen from the medieval time period. There are Jewish marriage documents from the medieval period that include the cost of henna as part of the expenses of the groom's family, and it was placed on the same level of importance as the bride's dress and jewelry. So that really goes to show you just what an integral part henna was to the culture and religion. Wedding festivities began when the groom sent henna to his bride. It would peak with henna ceremony and culminate with the wearing of the bride's henna. And originally in the Jewish tradition, the henna stain and application ritual were seen as trifold. You had the staining of the skin as beautifying, as daily adornment, and for weddings. The materiality of henna was thought as protective, especially of actors at the center of the passage ritual, so like the bride and her mother, for example, and the groom. Henna was seen as an aid in transforming and guiding the actors into the structure of their new social roles. And the other Abrahamic religion traditions stem from this origin in Judaism, and they evolved from that. And what's interesting with this picture here is you can actually see henna on the drum head and on the paper. Henna was also used in Christianity, and it was also evident in European cultures. It didn't stick with religion quite as strongly in Christianity in Europe. It became a little bit more non-ritual, and it was used a bit more for beautification purposes. In Europe, non-ritual henna usage was prevalent in southern regions of Spain, Italy, and parts of Greece as well. There are actually illuminated biblical manuscripts and folios that have angelic and Christ imagery with hennaed fingertips and what appear to be possible dot designs. We'll talk a little bit more about designs a little bit later. There are other manuscripts not of a religious nature, but made for Christians that have figures illustrated with hennaed hands and fingertips. So that image here on the slide, that's a detail from Alfonso X's Libro de los Juegos, which came from Toledo in 1283. And you can see on the woman's hands from about the knuckles all the way to her fingertips, that's hennaed. And you can see some dot designs around her knuckles as well. And so this would have been something for a Christian king, and she would have been a Christian woman playing these games with him. So it's evidence of it being used in a beautification type of purpose by a Christian for a Christian audience. And when the Spanish Muslim historian and traveler Ibn Jubair visited the city of Palermo in Italy in 1184, he wrote that the Christian women in Palermo follow the fashion of Muslim women. On the Christmas feast day, they parade to their churches bearing all the adornments of Muslim women, including jewelry, henna on their fingers, and perfumes. And there's also evidence from De Ornatu Mulierum, or the adornments of women, the third part of a Christian medical anthology from southern Italy, that Christian medical practice of that area and time suggested the usage of henna as a soothing ointment to apply after depilating, and recommended as hair dye. I actually find that depilating part interesting because depilating is removal of hair. And when you remove hair, you then have an open pore where the hair came out of. And as we discussed, when you put henna onto an open wound or something of depth in the skin, that can create a stain. So I find that kind of interesting that either they didn't mind that they had what looked like strawberry dots all over their legs or their armpits with henna dots, or it might be possible that, like the ancient Egyptians, they figured out, depending on where the henna was grown, maybe they had henna from a more damp region that wouldn't have had so much dye, but they could have had the nice anti-inflammatories and antifungal properties of the plant itself. I'm still looking into that, but having my knowledge on henna, it's kind of, why would they have used a straight henna paste onto open legs for little brown dots? I wouldn't think that that would be something that anybody would really want. So,
Hey, Eve, a person that has different pigmentation, does it affect different people? In other words, like if I'm African, does it work on my skin as well and show up as well as it would if I'm Caucasian? Is it pretty uniform across all pigmentation boundaries?
that can
Or does it?
absolutely be used on every single skin type, all depths of melanin. One of the main differences is you would just need to leave it on the skin a little bit longer to give that dye a really good chance to sink into the skin, because the dye molecules will be fighting the pigment molecules in the skin. So you really need to make sure that it's on there long enough. So at least 2-3 hours is what I always like to suggest. That way you can really make sure that you have that nice depth of the henna pigment afterwards.
Okay.
But
I
yeah,
thought that there might be some people, like if I'm sort of swarthy in complexion, that it doesn't show up on me as well, and therefore it's kind of a non-issue. As
there
far
are
as it.
some things with body chemistry, for example. There are some people where their body chemistry just doesn't take to henna application very well. They might only get a very light stain, whereas I typically get a really dark stain myself, no matter how well I take care of it or don't take care of it. I know that
Do you
sometimes,
think that has anything to do with, like, I'm very acidic pH wise? Like, so if I wear a leather watch band, in 6 months, I'm going to disintegrate it, because my natural acidity affects the leather. And
right, I
then,
totally
there's some people
understand.
that are more alkaline,
Exactly,
so,
something like that
and
would
they're just that way by
absolutely
nature.
affect it. Something like that would absolutely affect it. And there are also certain types of medications, or if people are on antibiotics, especially like those Z packs, for whatever reason, if you're on a Z
Mhm.
pack or antibiotic, henna just doesn't always stain as well. So that's another thing with the body chemistry.
Okay, thank you.
No, no problem. And if anybody has any questions along the way, feel free to ask. Okay, so we're just going to forward on to henna in Islam and Islamic cultures. This is kind of my wheelhouse through here, so I'm always excited when I get to this part. There's documentation from the 15th century by a Muslim Algerian jurist and legal scholar, al-Wansha Harisi, who wrote a compilation of legal decisions, or fatwas, of scholars from North Africa, specifically Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, and Al-Andalus. That's the Islamic region and Kingdom of Southern Spain. In this compilation of fatwas, there are many relating to henna, the significance of it, that it must be included with the bridal package given to the bride before marriage, and also the importance of henna artists for weddings in Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. And what's interesting is that importance of henna as a gift from the groom to the bride, as well as the importance of henna artists, has maintained even through to this day. So I always just find that fascinating that both due to culture as well as early legal decisions like fatwas, that the position of henna has really stayed very stable and very important through the centuries. Persia and Central Asia also developed a strong henna tradition, most likely through Islamic conquest, which would have brought henna with them. So there's poetry from Persia as early as the 10th century that mentions henna. And from the 12th century on, henna began to appear in various forms of Islamic artwork like tile work and miniature illustrations. And while the artwork may be representational or idealistic, and some are a little representative of imaginary worlds, especially when it comes to Persian tile work, we can assume that, much like clothing and artwork, the henna styles and patterns in real life were similar. And what's interesting is that from Al-Andalus and Northern Africa, there's quite a bit of written documentation of henna that's been found. But in Islamic Persia and Central Asia, we mostly have artistic representation of henna, and there seems to be a bit more of a lack of it appearing in written work. And this is one of my favorite pictures of henna from an earlier period. This is late 12th century in Iranian Anatolia. And what's interesting is you saw in some of those other pictures, it was really just the fingertips that were hennaed, the knuckles that were hennaed. It didn't really look like there was a whole lot of design to it. But if you look here, you can see circles, you can see lines. It definitely looks more complex and a little bit more intricate. And so what can be extrapolated from Persian and Central Asian artwork, we can get a picture of basic henna usage in the region. This is where things get really interesting, in my opinion, at least. So you start to see many figures with henna on both hands, including this picture here on the slide. So we tend to be right or left hand dominant. A lot of people are not ambidextrous or can't do decent artwork with both hands. So in these representations, you see henna oftentimes complex, like in this picture, on both hands. So what could that mean? That could mean that henna was done in a social situation. You would had to have had another person applying this henna to you. And while it's easy for a right-handed person to apply henna to their left, it's more difficult to apply with your non-dominant. So you would have brought in a skilled henna artist, especially when you start to see more of these complex designs, again, like in this picture. So an important takeaway is that the artwork is more complex, and that means that you would have had to have had a henna artist type of figure, a skilled artisan. And if you notice, the color is also very dark. You only get a really dark color like that if you've left that henna on for a few hours. The longer you leave the henna on, the darker your stain is going to be. So, for example, again in this picture is just fantastic for this whole thing. You see how dark that henna is. That person would have had to have left that on for hours, and it's on both hands, which means they didn't need to work. So this was someone that was able to bring in a skilled henna artist and would have to have had the luxury to sit with both hands not being used for multiple hours at a time, undisturbed. So this person would have been able to afford the luxury of skilled artwork and had the ability and position to not partake in physical labor. And there are other depictions of women with henna that's more brownish, not as intense in color, and it's also not as designed like this. So we might infer that that henna might have been more utilitarian rather than more of a luxury or applied in a social situation. And henna has also been used in Hinduism in India. Moving on a little further east here. It's believed that the henna tradition in India began in the regions of Rajasthan, Punjab, and Gujarat. And on the map on the bottom here, that's what I circled there so that you guys aren't just like, where on earth are these areas? So now you know. And if you remember, I had said that my favorite kind of henna comes from the Rajasthan area. It has a really great environment for good henna consistency, quality, color. I love it. So it's believed that uh, the people in India coated their hands and feet in henna paste, and they had discovered that even after the paste was removed, their body felt cooler where the henna stain was. So this led to blocking off large areas for cooling purposes, which evolved into rudimentary designs like circles surrounded by dots, with paste being applied with sticks and thin instruments. And with the arrival of the Islamic Mughal Empire, they brought more detailed designs with them. So they adapted intricate floral swirly designs related from the Persians, and this henna design culture came with them. And most artwork from the subcontinent still showed mostly the block style of henna even through the 19th century, but you can still come across more detailed pictures as well. Now, you don't always have a lot of artistic depictions of henna from our time period. That's why this picture here is from 1670. It's one of the closest ones I could find to SCA time period, but how do we know that it was used during SCA time period and earlier? Well, the predominant religion in the Indian subcontinent is Hinduism, which is recognized as one of the oldest continuously followed scriptural religions in the world. And the use of henna became religiously ritualistic. It's an integral part of weddings, New Year celebrations, and passage through important parts of life for beautification. And they have it written in very early Hindu scriptures about the importance of henna, especially for marriage. The Hindu bride cannot be married without the essential 16 ornaments of the Sola Shringar. The Sola Shringar is believed to combat the evil eye and the negative influences of the phases of the moon. And these 16 adornments include henna, sindoor, which is the vermilion red powder that they apply to their part, hair braided and decorated with flowers and jewelry, a mang tikka, the hair part jewelry, a bindi or tikka on their forehead, full eyeliner, heavy earrings, varied length necklaces, a Mongol sutra necklace, armbands and armlets, bangles, rings, an RC thumb ring, gold silver belt, anklets, and toe rings. So it's a whole list here. But henna was seen as one of the absolute integral parts of getting married in Hinduism since their very early days. So that's how we know that it was used in India through many centuries, including through the SCA time period. And I've included here just some designs in period to show you. So these here are all from Iran. And you can see some of the different designs here. And I really like this one on the right on this slide here because you can start to see they have the darkened fingertips, but you can see some more of the intricate designs rather than just that full palm or big wide lines. Here you can really start to see development of artistry, which I really liked. I also always like to talk about what I call henna mixology. So to create a good henna paste mixture, we have to understand why we use the different things that we use to make our henna. So you can make a henna paste just using henna powder and water, but you're really not going to get the best results. So to achieve the best dye release from the powder, we like to use something acidic. Different henna artists use different things, but what's really common are lemon juice, tea, coffee, vinegar, or even apple juice. I personally use lemon juice as well as black tea. I find that the two of them have a great acidic quality that really helps get that dye released from the henna. Um, for whatever reason, people always think that lime juice is a good alternative for lemon. Trust me, don't do it. Lime juice is very photosensitive and it can create burns on the skin if you're out in the sun. For flexibility and substance, a form of sugar is often used, but it's not mandatory. So sugar draws water towards it because it's hydrophilic and it keeps the paste from drying out too fast on the skin. And you want the skin to be on for a few hours to allow the dye to migrate from the paste into your skin. So this added moisture helps that process. It also gives a little bit of strength to the stretchy lawsone molecule. So that way the dye molecule has more of a chance again to get deeper into your skin for that nice deep dark stain. Some sources of sugar often used are cane sugar, molasses, pomegranate syrup. Those are some of the most common ones. I personally use cane sugar. Another common ingredient are what we call terps, which are monoterpene alcohols. Natural terps come from plants, and those with high levels of monoterpene alcohol can be distilled to create specific essential oils. So, for example, I like to use cajeput oil. Cajeput is related to tea tree, but it doesn't have that astringent quality. Um, and while lawsone is hydrophobic, opposite of hydrophilic, hydrophobic means that it pushes water away. It doesn't want to mix. Just like when you put olive oil into a bottle of water, it's not going to mix very well. Um, the lawsone dye works really well by mixing that terp oil as well as that nice acidic tea to help bring that dye out so that your main carrier isn't just the water itself. And common terps used by other henna artists include the tea tree and clove. Um, and those really help give a good deep dye. Not all terps are appropriate for all skin types, however. Some people have very sensitive skin and you can't use something like clove. Cajeput blends tend to be least reactive for sensitive skin types. Um, a number of artists also like to use lavender or rosemary oils that have a nice aromatherapy kind of quality, but they don't always have much of an impact on dye, but it is still something that you can use. Um, and I always have to say during every henna class, henna is never black. Never, never, never. What is called black henna is actually a black hair dye that people are applying to the skin. Hairdressers wear gloves for reasons while applying dye. You don't want it on your skin. It can create all sorts of skin problems, including scars and chemical allergies. So steer clear of anything that says it's black. Henna also has a very short shelf life. So once you mix henna, you've got maybe a week, week and a half to still get some dye quality out of that. The dye molecule just begins to break down over time. So after a week, week and a half, you're not really going to get much of a stain. So if you see henna sitting on a shelf that's, like in a cone, it's been pre-mixed, um, it you're almost guaranteed that it's been adulterated. Sometimes it's adulterated with anything like industrial dyes or ammonia, even. All sorts of who knows what. Don't put it on your skin. Um, it's also a myth that applying and rubbing lemon juice or terps on the skin before henna application help improve color. They actually need to be mixed into the paste to help that dye release. If you don't put that on your paste and it's only on your skin, you're not going to be helping that dye release. It's actually, it can sometimes impede the stain from getting into your skin. Um, and another thing that people usually bring up is using olive oil or another type of oil after removing the paste. That's another thing that we want to steer clear of if we want a nice dark stain, because one of the ways that it gets darker in your skin is through oxidation. If we cover the skin in an oil, you're not allowing that oxygen in, So you're not going to reach that nice depth of color that you want. And I'll be posting this later so that you can have the basic recipe. This is just a basic recipe that I use. Everybody has their own take on using different types of ingredients, different amounts, but like I said, I'll include this later. And I can also answer any questions that you have on it. And this here just shows a couple of different steps of making the henna process. So in one, you have the straight henna powder in my hand. And then 2 and 3 are just mixing it with the oils and the tea and the lemon juice. Now, what's interesting is you heard me talk about dye release. The top right is after I just finished mixing it. It's all nice and smooth, still kind of green looking, looks great. Then you see image number 5. It's a completely different color. That's because I let this henna paste sit for about 12 hours. And over the course of 12 hours, the dye molecules started to release from the henna itself. And so that's why it's kind of this brownish, slightly reddish color. And what's interesting is I always put a saran wrap on top of my bowl. And I always like to do this because it's a little fun. You kind of tilt your bowl a little like this, and you'll actually see the reddish dye across the top of the henna. It almost has a reddish sheen, and you can even see it kind of move a little bit on the top. It's really cool. That might just be a little bit of a henna geek moment, but I always think that's interesting. And I just have some useful resources. And I will post these in the event afterwards. That way you can see the resources. I have a bibliography. You can see my henna paste recipe and my tips and tricks. Okay. And so I'll stop share. There we go. I think it stopped sharing.
Yeah,
okay.
It did. It stopped.
Does anybody have any questions?
I do, but I'll let somebody else go first.
No problem. I hope I didn't rush through that.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. How long, if nobody's got a question, I will start in with questions. If you applied it to your skin, and I know that there are variations depending on my body chemistry and whatever other variables that come in, and it's going to be applicable to the individual. But just as a general rule of thumb, if you put it on there, like you put it on, how long are you going to let it sort of cure, if that's what you want to call it, before you remove it?
I think that's a good word to call it, actually, a cure. I usually suggest at least 2 hours. Each person is different, but 2 hours minimum works the best. The reason being, you have that paste sitting on top of your skin, and you have multiple skin layers. So you're giving that paste where the dye molecule is bumping around, you're giving it that time to slowly bump around and get into your skin layers. And also, depending on where on the body, you might want to leave it on longer as well. So for example, our palms and our feet stain very deeply because our skin layers tend to be thicker. There's also more what's called subcutaneous or fatty layer as well. And so that stains very well. It stains very deeply. But to get it to stain deeply, we need to leave it on for quite a while. So like I said, I always suggest at least 2 hours. If people can do 3 even, that's fantastic. When I do bridal henna, I actually recommend them to leave it on overnight. I bring sensitive skin paper tape with me, and I actually will paper tape them up just like a mummy. And that way it stays on them overnight as well. That way they can really get that nice deep color.
So there's not necessarily a maximum, like I don't want to go beyond 8 hours or something along those lines, that for most folks it would be okay.
No, there's no like maximum like that.
Well, I know that the process is, you guys, gals do a lot more of this stuff than that. But if you color your hair, you can't leave, you'll kill your hair. You'll do things. There's things that will happen based on what chemicals you're using, and you
Right.
have to be careful with that. But let's
With
say I left it on 3 hours. How long can I expect that to last before it is going to naturally lighten and be gone?
So that depends on where on the body and what you're doing besides wearing the henna. So we'll use our hands as an example. Um,
Hmm.
the tops of our hands are not as thick as the bottoms of our hands. So the top of your hand is going to be lighter than the palm of your hand. Um, and let's say you've left it on the 3 hours. Uh, you weren't scrubbing at it immediately. Within 48 hours, the stain is going to be nice and dark. It needs 48 hours to really reach what we call peak stain, which is when it's reached optimum oxidation. There we go. Now, let's say all that's perfect. Um, One way that henna lightens is, let's say you're washing dishes by hand. You're using cleaners around your house, wearing gloves a lot, things like that. Anything that's going to exfoliate your hands will make the henna lighter and not last as long. If you are not using heavy exfoliants, your palms might last upwards of about 2, 3 weeks, and then it'll really start to fade. You might still see a little bit of design like on the edges of your hands 3, 4 weeks later. But by the end of about 2 weeks or so, the top of your hand isn't going to have much of a stain left.
Well, we were talking to somebody like, okay, if you don't have any hair and you're going to do a big raven that goes down the top and side of your face, your head, but you work a job that
Mm-hmm.
when I go back to work, that has to be removed, you'd have to do a little investigation and planning to make. So you might want to even, my guess is based on what you're saying, I might even want to do some test stuff when I have more time and stuff to see how it's going to react to me with this particular, source of henna, and you'd have a better idea what the particulars I could expect would be. Does that
Yeah,
seem
you could
reasonable?
absolutely do like a test type of design like that. The scalp does stain pretty well. It doesn't last as long as your hands, just as an example, um, because our skin layers on our scalp are a lot thinner, and we also tend to have a lot more
Center,
oil
yeah.
in our scalp. So it will not last quite as long. So usually your scalp, usually within a week, it'll be gone. Especially if you're washing your hair and you're like scrubbing, or if you even just use like a regular shampoo on your head, even if you don't have hair, that will help get that off a little bit faster. I do often get asked to do henna at Pensick on scalps. I usually like to suggest not doing that during daytime, because if you have the henna on your head and it's hot and you start to sweat, that dye, like I was talking about in the bowl, how you could see the dye kind of moving
Hmm.
around the top in the liquid, that dye is in the paste. You're now sweating. The dye is getting into your sweat. And now you have dye going down your head and your neck,
Dripping down your head.
following like the sweat dribbles down your head. So that's something to consider in the future if it's hot daytime and having henna done.
They used to have these football jerseys. It's got those little pinholes in them.
Mm.
So if you wear that out like all day, you're going to get sunburn through the pinholes. It's going to leave a funny stipple pattern on you. Is what it's going to do.
Right.
If I have like henna on you, does that impede the ultraviolet rays from the sun from tanning you, or does it
It
make it go?
does.
What I'm asking is, are you going to get a sun? Can you get a sunburn that's either the opposite of the view, or whichever, whether it impedes or helps?
It
It's going to do
does.
one or the other more than likely.
It's really interesting. It's almost similar to like doing a resist dye, for example, where you might have string or wax, and then you dip it in the dye, and then you remove the wax, and there's no dye. It's the same kind of idea. So, for example, one of my friends in college, he was going on vacation to Puerto Rico, and I did a big design on his upper chest. And so he went to Puerto Rico and he got a gorgeous tan, but by the time he came back to New York, the tan went away, and now he just had this big design on his chest. And he said, "Oh my God, I'm supposed to go home and see my mom next week. She's going to think that I had like some sort of a tattoo. She's going to kill me." And I'm like, "Well, go get some fake tanner, I guess, because you're stuck with it now."
Well, and see, I would be like, okay, if you use, chemical tan, you're now introducing another set of chemicals into the mix, and I would be afraid that that might not work out the way I thought it would, because I don't know
You can
what's in
absolutely
that.
use you absolutely can use SPF over henna. It might just lighten it a little bit over time, but I would still suggest using an SPF just to be on the safe side because sun damage sucks. So still want to use SPF. Henna does work very well as a natural SPF, um, but something I'm often asked is, well, can I just put henna on my whole body then? We actually don't want to do that because it's not allowing our skin layers to have enough oxygen coming into them. And it takes the molecules of the dye take up too much room between the skin, so it can't process
So,
effectively. Yeah. So you don't want to apply it to your whole entire body, but it does still act like a natural SPF where it is applied.
I would assume it would be similar to like if I have a lightweight linen that you can see through. If you hold it up, you can see shapes and stuff, to the point. That'll shield you somewhat, but it's not much of a sun shield. Like you can still get sunburn through that if it's hot enough and you're out for long enough. But it does help some. I mean, it's not that it's the same as the sun going on your direct skin, but a lot of times people don't think they can get sun. Well, I have something over me. I can't get sunburn. No, you can.
Yeah,
And I would
absolutely. It
think the
does still
lighter,
And I'm also proof that you
the
can sunburn through clothing. 3 layers of clothing, and I got a sunburn in Ireland. That's the level of
I'm
patience.
assuming I'm assuming you're like me that you have very little pigmentation in your skin. You're very light. If you're light skin, if you have, especially have red hair, mustache, whatever, if you do that, then that means you tend to have lighter pigments and you're more susceptible to sunburn, I think, than
Hmm.
somebody that's darker colored or more used to it.
Does anybody else have any other questions? And I can talk either about historical or modern usage. Um, Sometimes this class, people tend to also ask about like my experiences doing wedding henna, anything like that. I'm open to anything.
Catherine, if you're talking, we're not hearing you come through.
It was a great presentation. Thank you. I
Oh,
didn't
absolutely.
know
Thank you so much.
that. I didn't know how widespread it was. Really something to look into. And you did it.
Yeah, thank you. It's really
I stumbled
fascinating.
over my words.
You're fine.
Good.
Yeah, it's really fascinating just seeing how widespread henna was and is used. Um, and something I meant to touch on that I forgot earlier. I keep meaning to add this to my slide, but I forgot. Um, so Judaism with henna, that's where the Abrahamic religion started. And unfortunately, the Judaic practice of using henna in Europe really died out during the Middle Ages due to places like Spain and Italy expelling the Jews. So, for the Jewish population to not be seen as other, they really left, unfortunately, the henna tradition behind. Um, but today, and even in a SCA period as well, henna is still used by Jewish populations like in Iraq and in the Middle East. Um, and it is used in Israel as well, even today. But unfortunately, in Europe, it has died out. I know that there are communities that are trying to bring back that tradition in the European Jewish communities, especially um, the communities in Spain and in parts of Italy. But I know it's been a bit of a struggle for them. And that's also what happened with the henna usage in the Christian religions in Europe. That started to also be left to the wayside because, as you saw from the Muslim scholar, he said that the Christian women in Palermo were adorning themselves just like Muslim women. And so that's another reason why Christianity also stopped using it in the Christian cultures in Europe stopped using it.
Very us versus them. Oh, we can't do that what those heathens are doing. Yeah.
Right. It was seen as oh, look, that's them. This is a marker that it's them. So we're going to not do it. And anybody that does that, we're going to kick them out. So that's one of the reasons why Europe unfortunately lost a lot of its henna traditions. But it's really cool finding it still in like that Folio de Juegos from Toledo, because that's actually written for a Christian audience in the 1200s, and there's figures in it with henna on it. So it's really interesting.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Are you applying this with, go ahead.
Oh, I apologize. I have a
No,
question
no.
about henna in India specifically.
Absolutely.
I have read elsewhere that when you're talking about like skin decoration in a early in like an early, like a pre-Islamic invasion Hindu context,
Mhm.
that there are some people I can argue that the designs were actually made with lac
So
rather
lac is
rather than with henna. And I know that I myself I've done a little tiny bit of research on this, and I've actually seen pictures, like slightly out of period Mughal pictures where the where you have Rajput women and um, Mughal women in the same picture, and the Hindu women, the Rajputs, have what's clearly like bright red on them, and then the Muslim women, the Mughal women, have like kind of the brownish red color that we associate with henna on their fingers. And I wondered if you had run across anything with that.
So lac is definitely a very different substance. Um, it doesn't last as long as henna. It's pretty much you paint it on and it's on as long as you've got it on. Um, and I know some of like the references that you're talking about where it shows like the two different colors. I have read that in some ways they think that might be an artistic representation just to separate visually who the Hindu people were and who the Muslim people were, besides just clothing differences. Because especially in Mughal India, they did incorporate a lot of um, Indian clothing as well as more Persian influenced clothing. They would kind of mix the two in some ways. Um, and so that might have been a visual kind of thing to help differentiate in a way. Um, I don't have a very strong answer besides, I just come across that. But lac was something that was used. I especially have come across seeing that in more like central southern type of India rather than using straight up henna. Um, but I know through studying like what was necessary for Hindu weddings, um, with that being part of the Solar Shringar, for example, that henna was seen as one of the must-haves for a bride, and with it being one of the oldest religious texts and it talking about needing to have henna for the bride, that's where that information had come from. Other than that, I don't have a whole heck of a lot of information on lock itself. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. I was just curious because I had also I had also heard it argued that in like that um in the translation where in the Sola Shringar where they're translating it as henna, it actually like the actual like word, if you go back to the Sanskrit, actually means color.
Mhm.
That it does, so it doesn't actually so it doesn't actually help because it doesn't actually specify what the heck it is that we're using to put color on people.
Mhm. Yeah, that would definitely be something to look into more.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean that was what I was told by a professor who was of mine who was a Sanskrit scholar anyway.
mhm.
So so I don't, you know, I don't know Sanskrit. I don't know one way or the other, but that was what I was told.
Yeah, that would definitely be something for
Yeah,
more
so it'd
research
be
to look more into.
yeah, for sure. Thank you though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Eve, I've got one more question for you. What sort of implement are you using to apply this, and how thick is the application?
So there are a couple of different ways that it can be applied. Um, these days, henna artists use various things. What I like to use are called henna cones. So it's similar to a florist wrap, like that cellophane wrap, and I chop it into a big right triangle, and then I roll it up and I make a cone. It kind of looks like it's similar to a piping cone, um, and fill it with henna.
Or like a cake
Yeah,
decorating thing that you use
exactly.
to write with icing?
It's
Okay, I
similar
know how
to
to do. I actually know how to do that.
that. It's similar to that. The hand mechanisms are a little bit different using a henna cone, um, but henna cones are really common for especially doing Indian style designs. It works really well for doing like curvy type of designs, swirly designs, which are what I really like to do. So it works very well for me. Another common one are Jack bottles. They're bottles that are about yay big. They're squeezy and they have like a little metal top that you can put on them. And the tops can come in different sizes, and you would squeeze the bottle to make the designs. I don't use
So
Jack bottles.
it's probably not that different than we got some resist stuff that you put on, like to do silk banners, that we did this, and then you color that, and that keeps it from spreading beyond the points that you want it to. And it dries and it cures. It's kind of comparable, I think, but it had a little cone thing that you applied that. Okay,
Yeah,
that
and
makes sense.
the Jack bottles tend to work really well if you're doing very geometric shapes, a lot of straight lines, because what's interesting with that stretchy molecule that I was talking about, that stretchy dye molecule, and adding the sugar into the paste, that creates a stretchy dye and stretchy paste itself. So you can kind of plunk a little bit down, lift up your implement, and bring it down, and you've kind of draped a straight line across on the skin.
A strand.
You're
Okay.
right. And so that's like a draping method. And that works very well if you're using one of those Jack bottles and you're doing very geometric shapes like you might see in Moroccan style henna. Um, Now, back in the day, before they had things to make, henna cones, they would oftentimes use like a little bowl with a stick. And one of the things that I always like to point out is if you've seen Kingdom of Heaven, I think it's on the extended version. I can't remember if it's on the theatrical version, but you can actually see Eva Green, the princess. You see her handmade with a stick, and she's actually making dot designs. She was doing henna.
Yeah, but her hand design was a lot more. It wasn't like long fluid things. It was more little small things. I thought like dots and shapes. But
Right. And
I was curious. So we're definitely not using like a brush or anything like that. That I
right.
have a better concept now.
Yeah, you want a slightly thicker application to have stronger designs. If you use a thinner application, or if you were to use a brush, that would create more of a shading type of effect. So you definitely want something where the henna paste is a little bit thicker.
But I'm not putting it on so thick as I would if I were doing a mud mask or
No,
anything
no.
like that. I'm not putting it on to that level of thick. Okay. Okay. So, and I'm sure there's some trial and error that.
Oh yeah, absolutely trial and error, and everybody's different too. So I'm self-taught. I didn't have anybody that held my hand. I figured out how to make my henna cones, figured out how to make my henna, and figured out like the hand mechanisms for using the cone. Then I go to some henna conferences, and there are people that are holding cones differently. There are people like doing things completely different than me, and they're like, where did you learn this? And I'm like, where did you learn that? But we had but the results were the same, and most importantly, we were all using natural ingredients. So yeah, it's a little bit of what works best for you, and it might not work best for somebody else.
Who do you? I don't. You want to? To me, like I wouldn't want somebody if I don't know what I'm doing. I don't want to practice on them because the results could be not to their liking. Is there a substitute or a practice medium? Like, see, my first thoughts, and I might be completely like 180 degrees the wrong way, but the closest thing that I can think of to humans is like you use pigs because they have comparable skin thickness and a lot of their uh, anatomy is similar to ours where we can test it. Could you get like pig skin or something and test it or something like that, without using a person?
So one common thing is using acrylic. So I have one buried away somewhere. My cat is asleep on my lap, so I can't easily just get up and grab it. But it's common to use like an acrylic square, or I have an acrylic hand. It's flat and it's bright white, and you can practice your henna on it and it'll dry. It won't stain the acrylic, but this way you can practice designs. I practiced on myself and on friends and willing people in my college dorm, but you can practice on like untreated leather, for example, untreated like suedes, things like that, because it will stain, but it won't be your skin, for example. But that would be a little bit more
Now I'm
pricey.
assuming when you say untreated leather, you probably mean veg tanned leather. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
tanned,
like you
it's
don't.
just not colored. Okay.
Yeah, you don't
Okay.
want tanned leathers like that.
I
Okay.
had I had a friend who in college who like when she was a teenager did a henna class in India. Like she was Indian, and she had done a henna course and at like a beauty school, and she said what they used there was toothpaste.
So you really don't want to be putting toothpaste on your skin.
Well,
I'm
well,
putting
well,
I'm
they,
putting
well,
on
they,
my
well,
esthetician
yeah,
hat now.
yeah,
Because the
yeah.
the chemicals that are in toothpaste work very well for our teeth, but they're actually very
Yeah.
caustic on
Well, they
skin.
well, yeah, well they weren't actually putting toothpaste on their skin. What they would do is they would just have like a hand drawn out on paper,
Oh, I understand.
and then they would like pipe it onto they'd pipe the toothpaste onto the hand
I
picture.
gotcha.
And they would just do that a lot until they, sort of got to the point that they were ready to actually practice with live henna on live people.
Another common one is you can use normal henna on paper, and it will stain paper once you scrape off the henna paste. Another one that I've heard, and this is from another professional henna artist, she likes to use chocolate frosting. She'll get one of those like tubs of chocolate frosting, and she'll scoop that into a henna cone. And she says that I haven't used it, so I can't really talk for it myself. But she said when she uses it in the henna cone, it has a very similar hand feel in the cone. Because that's one of the other big things.
Texture and consistency.
Mm-hmm.
Texture and consistency are probably the same, and it gives you the same. The pressure that works for the frosting works for about the same as the henna from her experience. I see what you're saying.
Right, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I was just checking to see if we had any further comments on the Facebook stuff before I log us on. But we're good. Most of it was stuff that had been actually talked about here.
Oh, okay.
So.
And did you have any other questions?
Not at the moment, but I know me. I'll think of some, but I'll message you. I'm not shy about asking, because I will, if I want to know, I'll ask. And and people should feel free. Hey, that's enough for today, or whatever.
Yep. I love talking about henna, and I always like to sign off my classes. I mean, it's just us now, but for whoever watches this later, I always like to sign off by sharing that now that you've taken this class, or if you've even had henna done once, you are now part of an unbroken usage of henna that's been around for 4,000 plus years. That's pretty incredible. You're now part of this huge thing that people have been experiencing for 4,000 years. And if you've never even had henna applied, but you sat in this class, you listened to me just blah, 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 saw my slides, you're now part of helping keep that tradition alive. It's been around for 4,000 years, and what helps keep it going are people studying it, are people having henna applied, participating in it, and keeping it alive. So it's been around for 4,000 years. Let's help keep it around another 4,000 years. You know what I mean?